Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. I'm your host, Greg Knuckles, and I think after 143 episodes, this is actually my first time hosting solo. So we'll see how that goes. Before we get into the episode for today, I do have a bit of an announcement up top. And that is that the next episode of the podcast, so not this one, but next one, will be our last episode for the foreseeable future. And, that may feel like a lot, so I do feel like I owe you a bit of an explanation as to why. So just to rewind a bit, going back to the start of the podcast, the main reason we started the podcast in the first place was to introduce Eric Trexler to the audience back in 2019. The reason for that is that Stronger by Science had always, it hadn't actually just been me, but I was kind of the in the public eye type of person for the business. I've always worked with my wife Lindsay, but yeah, I was the sole public facing person up until that point. And so I didn't want it to come across like Eric was just a guy who we hired and was working for us in kind of like a subordinate way when we were truly partners. That's, that's the role we brought him in as. And so podcasting is a good way to get people's personalities out there and to build a connection with people. And so we thought that would be a good way both to introduce him to you guys and also just to communicate and show that we were on equal footing there. So starting a podcast seemed like a logical thing to do. But if I'm just personally being totally honest, I have never particularly enjoyed podcasting. It was just not something I was ever that interested in doing long term. And the main reason for that is just I have much more of an affinity for writing. I think I'm a much better writer than I am a speaker. And I just like the written medium more. It allows you to take more time to think and choose your words better. For scientific communication, it's easier to cite and link sources. And I also just find writing to be way more helpful for forcing me to think through what I'm saying and to make sure I really understand the topics I'm talking about. Because when you're talking, you can, you can kind of jump from A to C and just kind of like bullshit your way through. And as long as you're decent at speaking, it can still sound convincing and come across okay. But in the written word, it's harder to hide like that. And so I find that writing just forces me to be a better and more careful thinker. And so yeah, that's something I've always really liked about it. But yeah, so when we parted ways with Trex, we debated whether we wanted to keep everything rolling along, including the podcast, or if we wanted to shift Stronger by Science into kind of like a quote-unquote low-power mode. So that would include stopping the podcast, posting way less frequently on social media, and just kind of going back to the way things were like pre-grad school, pre-mass, like 2017 and before. But we did make the decision to keep things rolling at that point, in large part just out of a sense of obligation. Like, you guys listen to the podcast, you like the podcast, and so we didn't want to let you down, especially so soon after Trex had left. Like, that would just feel like a really big shakeup. So we're like, yeah, let's keep doing this thing. So I kept it going alongside Pac and Milo, and they've been excellent co-hosts and partners for the show. But at this point, we're all getting busier, and we're working on growing different companies and just kind of moving in different directions. They're working on their app company, MyoAdapt, and trying to build out their personal brands. and I'm working on Macro Factor. And so we've tried a bunch of things, podcasting, YouTube, articles, newsletters, doing more on Facebook and Instagram, etc. Pretty much everything but TikTok. I don't want to say, they say never, but I feel like I can come pretty close to saying never. That's for the kids, and I do still have a bit of a spark of youth, but not that much. But yeah, so we've tried a bunch of stuff, but for now, we think it's time to pare it back and focus on just the couple of things that we think we can do really, really well and that feel most authentic to the Stronger by Science brand. And so, yeah, after 5 years of podcasting, more than 140 episodes, I think over 150 counting fireside chats, and several different co-hosting lineups, I think we've done about all we want to do with the podcast. And I'm now very excited to focus on other projects and things that I personally enjoy a little bit more, and things that I hope will resonate with the majority of the Stronger by Science audience. So we'll tell you more about that in our final episode of the podcast, which will be out in 2 weeks. And I do just want to say that it has, even though I personally don't have the largest amount of love for the medium of podcasting, one of the things that has kept it going and kept me going so long is that it is truly an honor to have been able to make this podcast for all of you for the last 5 years. If not as many of you listened and had good feelings about the podcast, we definitely wouldn't have kept it going this long. And just you guys being so great has probably bought the podcast like an extra year and a half of life, if I'm being totally honest. So it truly has been an honor. I think it's been a good run, and I am truly grateful to everyone who has listened over these past 5 years. But after the next episode, the podcast will be going on indefinite hiatus. That doesn't mean that there will never be another episode again. I'm sure at some point I don't want to say I'm sure. I assume at some point in the future there will be some topic that comes up that lends itself to more of a discussion type thing rather than like a big article or whatever. So I don't know. Like there's a non-zero chance that there might be more podcasts at some point in the future, but in terms of like a regular release schedule and episodes frequently coming out, that the next episode will be the last one, I think, in kind of the main run of the podcast. But to go out on a high note, the final episode will be an all Q&A episode. So if you've ever had a question that you would like us to answer on the podcast, there has literally never been a better time to ask it. So think about those questions, record a voice clip, 60 seconds or less, and email it to podcast@strongerbyscience.com, and we will answer the questions we like the most. Also, just before getting into the topic of the episode, I do just want to head this off because people online like to gossip and whatnot. Yeah, so I'm hosting this solely because, and you'll see this very soon, the topic of this episode, the stuff I prepared for it, really is just like me talking type of thing. Like when me and Pac and Milo looked over the outline, we're like, yeah, there's not really that much. There aren't that many places where like crosstalk and like back and forth would really make a ton of sense. So I mentioned up top that some of the content changes coming at Stronger by Science are in part due to the fact that I and them are kind of focusing on slightly different things. That is in no way indicative of beef. We're all cool. I understand how that might seem, like, mention that. This is my first time hosting solo. The last time there were solo hosted websites or episodes of the podcast, that was a harbinger of something to come. So like I get all of that context, but to be exceedingly clear, it is just purely the fact that this that the topic for this episode just wasn't something that it made a ton of sense to have multiple mics on. So yeah, that's it. That's the announcement. Thanks for sticking with us for these last 5 years, and thanks for sticking with me through the announcement. So let's get into the episode. So in this episode, I will be discussing basal metabolic rate, or BMR. If you follow the Macro Factor website as well, a lot of this is going to sound pretty familiar because we recently published a pretty big article series on BMR that will be linked in the show notes if you want to check it out. And I would recommend you do so. What I'll be doing in this episode is giving a bit of an overview of the topics discussed in that article series, but as I mentioned up top, I love the written medium. I think you can get into things in more detail, link sources better, all of those things. So it's a good series of articles, and check it out if this is a topic that interests you. So how this all came about is we were looking back at our like onboarding flow and program recommendations and all of that stuff at Macro Factor to make sure that they were still aligned with the research. And so one of the things that I was looking into is how we went about doing the initial TDEE, or total daily energy expenditure calculation, in the app. And the way we do that, and the way that basically anyone would do that, is you start by estimating BMR, and then you multiply that by some activity factor to estimate total daily energy expenditure. And so you want the most accurate BMR estimate possible, because any error in your BMR estimate is going to be propagated and magnified. Like if you're underestimating by 200 calories and then you select the right activity factor, and let's say it's 1.5, then when you multiply, like you have that 200 calorie error, and if you multiply the correct value by 1.5, you'd wind up with the correct total daily energy expenditure. If it's a 200 calorie error multiplied by 1.5, now your error for predicting total daily energy expenditure is 300 calories. So basically, like any error in the BMR estimation stage propagates and is magnified. So we wanted to take a peek back at that and try to make sure we had the most accurate BMR predictions that we could. So I was checking that out, just wanting to review the research to make sure the formula we were using was still the way to go. And as I'm wont to do, once I start digging into the research on something, I fall down a bit of a rabbit hole, and I keep falling and I keep falling, and I learn a bunch of cool stuff. And something that I thought would take like 2 days ends up taking like 2 months, and I have a lot of fun in the process and come out the other side, hopefully with interesting information that other people will find as interesting as I do. So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. I personally learned a lot of cool stuff in the process, and I think a fair bit of the stuff I learned is things that I suspect a lot of people aren't aware of. So even though BMR is maybe like slightly outside of the realm of the things that we tend to talk about on this podcast, like not way outside the realm, but if there's like a distribution of things we tend to talk about, this might be like a standard deviation and a half from the norm or something like that. But I do think that this is a good topic for a couple reasons. One is that this is a topic that a lot of people don't think too much about in the first place. They just kind of plug their numbers into a BMR calculator, assume the output is correct, and don't think too much about it. So if you fall into that camp, I think you'll learn a lot from this episode. And for the people that do think a little bit about BMR and things that affect it, I think that there are a lot of common misconceptions and incorrect beliefs that people have. So if you fall more into that camp, hopefully, you might learn a little bit less than the first person who doesn't think about this at all. But, there might be some things in this episode that challenge some of your current beliefs, and hopefully you learn something fun. So yeah, just up top, terminology. So I mentioned this is an episode about BMR, or basal metabolic rate, and that is essentially just how much energy your body burns at rest. And I will note for pedants out there in the audience, which, if that's you, no judgment. I myself tend to be quite pedantic, but I will just acknowledge up top, BMR actually isn't the correct term for most of what we're going to be talking about in this episode, but it's close enough. And so what I mean by that is there are several different terms that describe similar but slightly different concepts, including basal metabolic rate, or basal energy expenditure, sleeping metabolic rate, or sleeping energy expenditure, and resting metabolic rate, or resting energy expenditure. And for the purpose of this episode, I'll be using all three of these terms interchangeably, but mostly BMR. But technically, this episode is mostly about RMR, or REE, so resting metabolic rate, or resting energy expenditure, which is basically the amount of energy your body actually burns at rest most of the time. So, if you get off work and you sit on the couch and just hang out there for 5 minutes or whatever, the amount of energy you're burning at that point is probably pretty close to your RMR. But it's likely a little bit above your BMR and your SMR, or sleeping metabolic rate. Basically, your BMR is the amount of energy you burn first thing in the morning. So you sleep, you wake up, and people assess how much energy you're burning, and that's your BMR. Your sleeping metabolic rate, quite intuitively for the name, is how much energy you burn when you sleep. And sleeping metabolic rate is lower than the other two. BMR is in the middle, and then RMR is slightly higher than BMR typically. But the vast majority of the research on the topic does RMR, basically because the subject burden is so much lower if you actually want to study it. So to assess sleeping metabolic rate, or BMR, subjects need to sleep in the lab overnight, which is, if you could have if you could take a measurement that basically just required people to show up to the lab, sit quietly for 15 minutes, put a mask on for 30 minutes, and then they can go on their merry way, or something that is basically the same measurement but requires people to sleep in the lab overnight, most researchers and most subjects are going to say, let's go the RMR route. So, most of the research technically is on RMR, but the reason I'll be using BMR as the term in this episode, and the title of this episode, is just the term that most people are most familiar with. And again, outside of like academics and pedants, most people use all of those terms interchangeably anyways. So just know, most of the time in this episode when I say BMR, I actually mean RMR, but we're going to say BMR, and we're going to be on the same page about that, and hopefully that is okay. So yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. So the first thing I want to talk about is determinants of BMR. And just one note here. Like I mentioned, most of this will be summarizing and giving a bit of color to an article series that was published on the macro factor website. That article series will be linked in the show notes, and the studies that I reference in this episode will be referenced in those articles. So if you look down there and the reference list is a little bit shorter than normal, basically like the section of the episode will refer to a particular article, and any source I mention will be linked in the article if you want to check it out more. So yeah, the first thing I'm going to be talking about here is determinants of BMR. So if you've ever looked at a BMR prediction equation, you've probably noticed they mostly take one of two forms. One form is it's predicting BMR from height, weight, age, and sex. Or two, it might be predicting BMR based on your fat-free mass. So if you're familiar with those equations, you've looked at them before, it's natural to assume that those factors are the determinants of your BMR. Or you might assume that fat-free mass is the determinant, and things like height, weight, age, and sex aren't actually determinants, but they're useful correlates because they're predictive of fat-free mass, and fat-free mass is the actual determinant. However, those aren't actually the determinants of your BMR. We can do quite a bit better than that. Your BMR is actually determined by the amount of each type of tissue your body has in a much more granular way than just total fat mass and total fat-free mass, and two, the BMR of each of those specific tissues, so tissue-specific BMRs. And that's an important distinction because most of your BMR is accounted for by actually a very, very small percentage of your total body tissue mass. So about half of your BMR just comes from your heart, liver, kidneys, and brain. Your heart and kidneys have a tissue-specific BMR of about 440 calories per kilogram. Your brain has a tissue-specific BMR of about 240 calories per kilogram, and your liver has a tissue-specific BMR of about 200 calories per kilogram. Those four organs collectively generally account for around or slightly less than 5% of total body mass, but they typically account for right around or slightly more than 50% of your total BMR. In contrast, muscle has a BMR of about 13 calories per kilogram, and fat, adipose tissue, has a BMR of only about 4.5 calories per kilogram. So those two tissues typically account for over half of your body mass, but only tend to account for around a quarter of your total BMR. So the upshot there is that organ mass, and this is something we're going to come back to quite a few times in this episode. Organ mass is really, 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 really important for determining your BMR. That will be a recurring theme in this episode because a surprising amount of BMR-related facts and scientific findings will ultimately be explained by things related to organ mass. So that's going to be fun. Okay, so moving on. The next BMR-related topic to discuss here is the accuracy of those BMR prediction equations. And there is a very common, I think, tacit misconception. I don't know how frequently people explicitly think about this, but I think most people tacitly believe that BMR prediction equations are really accurate. You pull one up online, you plug in your height, weight, age, and sex, or you plug in your fat-free mass, and it spits out a number, and you just kind of assume like, yeah, that's probably about right. Like, that's probably pretty close. And I think a lot of people do believe it's quite accurate, just based on the way I see people talk about these things, like very, very confidently. Like, someone might be pursuing a pretty aggressive calorie deficit and just be like, oh, well, to lose weight at this rate, like I'm going to have to consume fewer calories than my BMR, and I assume that that's a bad thing. And then it's like, well, how do you know? Like, it's like, well, punch my numbers in a calculator. Like, it's less than this number. It's like, well, you know, that your actual BMR could actually be quite a bit higher or lower than that, but and then the rejoinder is just like, well, the calculator can't be that wrong. It's like, well, it could be. And yeah, so that applies to people using like online BMR calculators, or something I'm seeing more and more frequently. And I think this is what people have the most misplaced confidence in is there's like a lot of businesses now where you pay them like $75 and they'll do like a DEXA scan or put you in a bod pod. And the printout that people get from those places, it's not just telling them their body composition, it also tells them their BMR. And I think just because there's like a machine involved, it feels very high tech and sciencey, and people are like, ooh, yeah, the bod pod measured my BMR and it told me that it is whatever, like some number. But like those things literally use the exact same prediction equations that an online calculator would. Like I think most of them use the 1991 Cunningham equation, or the sometimes erroneously referred to as the Ketch-McArdle equation. Like all they're doing is they're estimating your body composition and then just punching that number into just a very standard BMR prediction equation and then saying, here's the number. But yeah, I think people take those numbers to be like way, way more accurate than they actually are. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people, a lot of the time, tend to think the BMR prediction equations are pretty accurate, but they're not. They can over or underestimate BMR by comfortably 300-400 calories. So to quantify how accurate a prediction equation is, you can measure or estimate the size and frequency of errors it produces using something called a Bland-Altman plot. And this is primarily an audio medium, so I'm not going to walk people through how to construct a Bland-Altman plot step by step. But basically, you measure the outcome of interest, you compare that measurement against the predicted value in this case, and then the x-axis of the chart is the average of the measurement and prediction, and the y-axis for each point, like the y value for each point, is the size and direction of the measurement error. And so with a Bland-Altman plot, you can calculate the average prediction error. You can calculate whether the prediction error has any bias. So like, does it more reliably under or overestimate BMRs for people who have high or low BMRs? That's a little bit beyond what we're talking about here, because most of the equations don't have a ton of like systematic bias like that. But, and here's the important bit, you can also calculate what's called the limits of agreement. And what the limits of agreement are is basically a range where 95% of the errors should fall. So it's 2 standard deviations above and below the mean error. And so the limits of agreement, like you don't have to be an outlier, like have an outlier high or low BMR for your amount of fat-free mass, or your height, weight, age, and sex, in order to fall outside the limits of agreement. Like that's where 95% of values should fall. So however wide those limits of agreement are, if you're in a room with 100 people, you should kind of expect about 5 of them to fall outside of that range. So again, like we're not talking about 1 in 10,000 type outliers, just kind of like the normal amount of variability and magnitude of errors that tends to occur. And there's been quite a lot of research looking at the accuracy and validity of BMR prediction equations, calculating those limits of agreement, showing Bland-Altman plots. And what you tend to see is that for good BMR prediction equations, the typical error, like the average error, is small, as one would hope and expect, usually like less than 50 to 100 calories. For some equations in some populations, like the error can be quite a bit larger, but again, we're talking about like good BMR prediction equations. Typical error is usually pretty small, like generally less than 50 calories, but limits of agreement are always fucking wide, like quite wide. Most of the time, they're somewhere in the neighborhood of about 800 calories. You can find studies, typically studies where a new BMR prediction equation is being developed that report smaller limits of agreement than that. And that's basically showing you like a best case scenario where basically however well an equation performs in the population where it's developed, when you generalize it to other populations, it does worse. Basically because like it is tuned for the testing sample, more or less. But yeah, like you can occasionally find like new papers where new equations are developed with tighter limits of agreement, but in sort of like external validation papers where you recruit a group of subjects and you use equations that already exist to see how accurately those predict BMR. What you tend to see is limits of agreement that span a range of about 800 calories. So that means that standard deviation there is like 200 calories. Typical error is around 250 calories above or below. Like that's the average. A lot of people less than that, some people above. And then errors in the 400 calorie range are less common but not unheard of. Basically, like around 5% of people should have errors larger than 400 calories. So yeah, like for most people, it will be less. For most people, it'll be like 200 calories or less. Like you get a decent ballpark estimate. But yeah, like relatively large errors are relatively common. And I just don't think enough people realize that. And again, if you're interested in seeing some research and learning more about that, the article discussing it will be in the show notes if you want to dig in further. But this begs the question of why are errors so large sometimes? And the answer is, and if you've been listening to this point and I said something was going to be a recurring theme, you might be yelling out on your walk right now, Greg, I know what it is. I know what it is. I've been listening. And if that's the case, you're right. Organ mass. That is the main reason why relatively large prediction errors are relatively common from BMR prediction equations. So, as mentioned before, your high metabolic rate organs, your brain, your liver, your kidneys, and your heart, heart, brain, liver, kidneys. Yeah, just making sure I said them all. Those account for like half of your BMR, but they're a very, very small percentage of your total body mass. And the thing is, the mass of all of those organs, except kind of your brain, like brain size does scale a little bit with height and a little bit with body mass, but like brain size doesn't vary as much between people as like heart, kidney, and liver mass does. But those other three organs, like they do scale with things like height and weight and total fat-free mass, but it is a surprisingly weak relationship. So there were some studies by researchers named Molina and DeMau. You can find that research in the linked article, examining cadavers, where they basically looked at like weight at time of death, and they dissected the corpses and actually like weighed the organ masses to see like, hey, how well does organ mass associate with height and weight and things like that. And they found that the strongest association was between body mass and heart mass. But even that had a decent R squared value of like 0.66, which is that's a reasonably strong association. But even with heart mass, there's quite a bit of variability. So someone who weighed around 70 kilos might have, like from their data set, might have a heart that's like a little under 200 grams or around 350 grams. So even at the same body weight, even with like the strongest association seen in their data set, you could have heart mass varying within like nearly a twofold range for two people with the same body mass. And that was the strongest association that they observed. So liver mass, kidney mass, brain mass, way weaker relationship with height and weight than heart mass. And even the relationship between like body weight and heart mass wasn't that strong. So, so just to illustrate, if the mass of your high metabolic rate organs was 30% greater or less than normal for your height, weight, age, and sex, or total amount of fat-free mass, your BMR would likely be around 20-25% higher or lower than would be predicted based on those easily observable demographic or anthropometric characteristics. And having 30% more or less high metabolic rate organ mass than average is like very comfortably within the realm of normal. Like high metabolic rate organ mass varies quite a bit, and it's associated with, but not that strongly associated with, things that we can observe and measure much easier, like height and weight or fat-free mass. So yeah, that's the main reason that there are frequently like pretty large errors when trying to predict BMR from factors like height, weight, age, sex, or fat-free mass. What we see in research where the researchers do full body MRI scans to estimate the volume of each organ, and then using like known values of organ density to estimate the mass of each organ, and then estimate BMR from there, knowing those tissue specific BMRs. In studies where they do that, they can predict BMRs like way more precisely. So instead of a range of like plus or minus 400 calories, it's plus or minus like 150 calories. Like they can be way more accurate if you can actually like estimate organ mass quite accurately. So the variability in high metabolic rate organ mass is the main reason why BMR equations frequently produce fairly large errors. Okay, so that's that. BMR equations not as accurate as people tend to think. And for topics like this, I do think it's always important to note that when we're talking about variability, for some people, BMR prediction equation will perfectly estimate your BMR. That's like if it didn't, for some people, some of the time, it wouldn't be good for much. So if you've ever gone somewhere and like put on the mask or the tube and done some indirect calorimetry and actually measured your BMR or RMR, and it was exactly the same as a value that would come out of a prediction equation, you might be tempted to say, well, yeah, I did this and this equation was really accurate for me. And if that's the case, good for you. I'm genuinely happy for you. That's a good bit of information to have in your back pocket, to know that some BMR prediction equation works really well for you, and you're fairly close to the population norms there. That does not say anything about the frequency and magnitude of errors that a lot of people will experience. So to be clear, just because BMR prediction equations can produce large errors, that doesn't mean that they will for you or that they will for everyone. Just that the precision of the estimate is quite a bit worse than I think a lot of people suspect. Okay, so moving on to the next topic here, let's talk a little bit about the impact of sex on BMR. So sex as in biological sex, male and female. I feel the need to say that because I was recently a co-author on a paper looking at the impact of sex on hypertrophy, and the comments were exactly what you'd expect them to be, and I gotta say, that joke, funny and original every time. The impact of coitus on getting jacked? No, like you didn't think that, shut the fuck up. So yeah, the impact of sex on BMR. So just up top, just to establish things that I think most people are well aware of already, men tend to have higher BMRs than women. But the difference there is primarily due to differences in total body size and total and body composition. So equations that predict BMR from factors like height, weight, and age and sex generally find that men have BMRs that are around 150 to 200 calories higher than women at the same height, weight, age, and sex. So you can see that in just kind of the mechanics of the equations themselves. So something like the popular Mifflin-St. Jeor equation, you predict a BMR thusly. It's 10 times weight in kilograms plus 6.25 times height in centimeters minus 5 times age plus, for men, plus 5, for women, minus 161. So it's the exact same equation until the last term, the constant. And for men, you add 5. For women, you subtract 161. The coefficients for all of the other terms are exactly the same. So yeah, basically, the functional upshot of that is just at the same height and weight and age, it predicts that men will have a BMR that's about 166 calories higher than women. And that's what you see for equations like that have a specific term for sex or different coefficient, or the same coefficients for height, weight, and age, and then just like a different constant for sex. You tend to see differences in the 150 to 200 calorie range most of the time. But those differences seem to primarily be driven by differences in body composition. So at the same height and weight, men tend to be a little bit leaner and have a little bit more total fat-free mass. And the main reason for that is just differences in essential fat. So just to stay alive, men need to be at least like 3-4% body fat. For women, it's like 12-ish. So yeah, at any, like two people that are like the same like visual level of leanness. Like if you look at a completely shredded male bodybuilder and a completely shredded female bodybuilder, the man's body fat percentage is probably like 9-10% lower than the woman's, just due to differences in essential fat. And yeah, so that kind of trickles down to differences in body comp at kind of any level of like relative leanness. And that difference in body composition is like pretty much fully explains the differences in BMR when controlling for things like height and weight. So in equations that predict BMR purely from fat-free mass, so like the Cunningham equation or the Ketch-McArdle equation, or the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation that uses fat-free mass instead of height, weight, and age, those equations are the same between sexes. So at a particular level of fat-free mass, you'd predict that a male and a female would have the same BMR. And yeah, so that's relatively straightforward. When controlling for differences in body mass, we don't tend to see major sex differences in BMRs. But there is a fun kind of upshot of that, bringing organs back in, and that is that women actually have slightly higher BMRs per unit of fat-free mass than men do. So just to illustrate, the most common equation that you'll see when people use to predict BMR from fat-free mass is the 1991 Cunningham equation, again, often erroneously referred to as the Ketch-McArdle equation. And that equation is BMR equals 21.6 times fat-free mass in kilograms plus 370. And so women generally have around 40 to 50 kilograms of fat-free mass. Obviously, some have less, some have more, but that's kind of like the range in which most people in the population fall. And men tend to have around 55 to 65 kilograms of fat-free mass. Again, some people have more, some people have less, but most people fall into that range. And when you plug values in the middle of those ranges into that equation, so 45 kilos and 60 kilos, you get 1,342 calories for women and 1,666 calories for men. And per kilogram of body mass, that's right around 30 for women and like between 27.5 and 28 for men. And that's pretty typical in research. So women's BMRs, when expressed in calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, tend to be around 2 to 3.5 calories per kilo higher than men's. And, I was going to say, do you know why that is? But I've already given it away. And that is primarily differences in organ mass. So smaller people and people who have less total fat-free mass, period, generally have a higher proportion of their total fat-free mass coming from high metabolic rate organs. So just to illustrate, and this is based on some research by Muller and colleagues, someone with about 40 kilos of fat-free mass, you would expect around 8% of their total fat-free mass to come from high metabolic rate organs. Again, brain, heart, kidneys, and liver. Whereas for someone with 80 kilos of fat-free mass, you'd expect around 6% of their total fat-free mass to come from those high metabolic rate organs. And since that high metabolic rate tissue is where most of your BMR comes from, just that 2% difference leads to a relatively small but measurable difference in BMR expressed in terms of calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. And to be clear, I say that women tend to have higher BMRs in terms of calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. But that is just generally true of smaller people versus larger people. So women tend to be a bit smaller, tend to have a bit less fat-free mass than men, but you see the same relationship within sex as well. So smaller women tend to have higher BMRs per kilo of fat-free mass than larger women. Smaller men tend to have higher BMRs per kilo of fat-free mass than larger men. And man and woman of the same general size, similar amounts of fat-free mass, tend to have similar BMRs, period. So, yeah, I just thought that was fun. Again, BMR mostly driven by your organs, and relative organ mass, so high metabolic rate organ mass relative to total fat-free mass, tends to decrease as total fat-free mass increases. So yeah, that's it. Impact of sex. Moving on, the next two topics I'm going to go over pretty quickly. That is the impact of age and the impact of weight loss on BMR. The reason I'm not going to talk about these in detail is that I think most people listening to this probably know a decent bit about both of these topics already. In terms of the impact of age, there was a study by Ponzer and colleagues from 2022 that was spread far and wide. I think almost everyone who would be interested in Stronger by Science content would have come in contact with this study, and I'm pretty sure we talked about it on the podcast as well. But if you want to check it out, the title is Daily Energy Expenditure Through the Human Life Course. And that study found that BMR, when adjusted for body mass and body composition, doesn't really start to decrease rapidly until around 60 years old. Up until that point, through most of adulthood, it's fairly stable. So like if it decreases from, say, your 30s to your mid 50s, that's primarily from like, you know, maybe like losing some muscle mass, like being more sedentary. And so like on an absolute basis, it might decrease, but when adjusting for changes in body mass or body composition, it tends to be like pretty steady through most of adulthood. And then even when correcting for changes in body mass and body composition, you see it start to decline past about age 60. So yeah, like I think everyone and their mother heard about that study. Like it was written up in the New York Times. It was not just on social media, like just like every outlet with a health section, I think, picked it up. And yeah, there's really not too much to say about it other than that. There is more research on the topic, and other research on the topic has had similar findings as well. Things are pretty consistent through most of your adult life, but you do start to see relative declines in BMR past about age 60. And the reason I'm not going to talk about the impact of weight loss on BMR a ton is that that topic has a name that I think most listeners of the podcast will be well aware of, and that is it's one component of metabolic adaptation, which is something we've done, I'm sure, multiple episodes on, and it's a big topic. So if it's a topic that interests you, go back in the archives and look for metabolic adaptation. I'm sure you will find plenty of content on it. And for the people that do listen to every episode, I don't want to bore you with a bunch of content that you're already very familiar with. But the very short version is that when you lose weight, your BMR goes down. Part of that decrease is due to just loss in body mass and loss of fat-free mass. But part of that decrease is disproportionate to the amount of total tissue you lose. And that delta is termed metabolic adaptation. So basically, if given the amount of fat-free mass you have, you'd be predicted to have a BMR of 1,500 calories before weight loss. And let's say your actual BMR is 1,500 calories before weight loss. And then you shift into an energy deficit, you start losing weight, you lose some weight, and then based on the amount of weight you've lost and the composition of the tissue you've lost, you'd predict that your BMR might have decreased to 1,400 calories. What we see oftentimes during periods of active weight loss is it might actually go to 1,300 calories, and that disproportionate decrease is termed metabolic adaptation, and that is something that we observe. It is typically to a pretty restrained degree the extent to which it happens. Like most of the time, your BMR during weight loss will be like 5 to 10% below what it would be during a period of weight maintenance. And that, you know, it's not nothing, but like if your BMR would usually be like, I don't know, let's just say 1,500 calories. That's a difference of typically works out to around like 100 calories or so, which again isn't nothing, but that's like the energy in a banana. So you do see a bit of a disproportionate decrease during periods of active weight loss, but it's not huge, and most of that decrease goes away once you finish your diet and start maintaining your weight again. So yeah, that's the short version of the metabolic adaptation spiel. The one note that I did want to make, though, is that, and this is a fact that I don't think people are aware of, but should be very predictable by this point in the episode, is that during weight loss, you don't just lose fat, you don't just potentially lose muscle, you also lose organ mass. And there is, in fact, a bit of a bit of a debate going on in the metabolic adaptation literature about how much like quote unquote true metabolic adaptation occurs. Most people still think it does occur, but it's a question as to like the magnitude, because there have been some studies that have actually done full body MRIs to assess changes in high metabolic rate organ volume, and from that you're estimating mass as well. And like around half of the disproportionate decrease in BMR observed during weight loss seems to be explainable by losses in high metabolic rate organ mass, particularly liver mass and kidney mass to a slightly lesser degree, less so heart mass and brain mass. But yeah, like your liver gets a bit smaller, your kidneys get a bit smaller, and so, in that illustration I gave before, you'd expect your BMR to decrease from 1500 to 1400. It actually decreases to 1300. People go in and take MRIs and say, oh, no. Based on the total amount of fat-free mass they lost, you'd expect it to decrease to 1400. But they actually lost a bit more liver mass and a bit more kidney mass than you would expect during this period of weight loss. So when accounting for that, you'd actually expect their BMR to decrease not to 1400, but to 1350. So the total amount of metabolic adaptation that took place here wasn't 100 calories. It was actually just 50 calories when accounting for the changes in high metabolic rate organ mass that occurred as well. So yeah, I think that's cool. It appears that around half of the observed metabolic adaptation that occurs, if you think about metabolic adaptation as disproportionate decreases in BMR relative to like total fat-free mass or total body mass, it seems like around half of that delta isn't like true metabolic adaptation. It's actually just due to loss in high metabolic rate organ mass that occurs with weight loss. That seems to be it seems to explain like a fair bit of the variance in what many would assume to be metabolic adaptation. And in terms of like parsing definitions, if you do or do not want to account for changes in high metabolic rate organ mass when you like conceptualize metabolic adaptation, I'm not going to fight you either way. Since most people aren't using whole body MRIs on a regular basis, you have no way of knowing if you lost some liver mass during your most recent cut. So I think it's totally fair to conceptualize metabolic adaptation as like, hey, I didn't lose much muscle, but like it does seem like I'm burning quite a bit less energy. Like that's metabolic adaptation. Like that seems fair to me. It's just like when the nerds can measure more stuff and adjust for those things they're measuring, it does seem like some of that decrease is due to loss in organ mass. So yeah, shifting gears. Next topic is weight gain. How does weight gain impact your BMR? And this one's interesting because I don't see that many people talking about it in detail. Most of the time when you hear people discuss changes in energy expenditure during periods of weight gain, it's mostly people who self-describe as hard gainers that are just like, oh man, like I was maintaining my weight on 3,000 calories and I've upped it to like 4,000 and I'm not gaining any weight. And like, yeah, like you hear people talk about that. But I don't really see people discussing research on that topic all that frequently. And obviously those anecdotes, they may not be representative or they may not be reflecting changes in BMR. It could be more like non-exercise activity thermogenesis or something else, So I did want to talk about this a little bit because when digging into the research, I did find it quite interesting because it does seem like there is a bit of a mystery here. And so yeah, the question at hand is kind of like, do we observe like reverse metabolic adaptation when people gain weight? And by that, I don't mean people shifting from a cut to bulking and the metabolic adaptation they previously experienced going away when they shift into an energy surplus. I'm talking about like if someone is at maintenance and then they start gaining weight, do they observe a disproportionate increase in resting energy expenditure the same way you might observe a disproportionate decrease when losing weight. And the answer to that question seems to be no but. And the but is that for some reason, and I'm not saying this doesn't exist in the research, but I am saying I looked quite a bit and couldn't find it. It doesn't seem like there's a clear explanation for this, but it does seem like when people overfeed, like when people are enter in energy surplus for like a month or two, maybe, their BMR is about 5 to 10% higher than you would predict, for no well understood reason. And then past that point, it's more or less what you would predict. So basically, let's say your BMR is 1,500 calories and you shift into an energy surplus. Overnight, your BMR might increase to, say, 1,600 calories and stay around 1,600 calories before you've even started gaining much, if any, weight. But then by the time you've gained some weight where you would predict your BMR would be 1,600 calories, it's still kind of around 1,600 calories. And then it more or less tracks with body weight from there, where it doesn't disproportionately increase and stay disproportionately elevated as you continue gaining weight. It seems that for whatever reason, there is just like a short-term bump that then just kind of like goes away. And after like a prolonged energy surplus, your BMR is like more or less where it would be, relatively speaking, as it would be at maintenance. So like if you shifted from a surplus back to maintenance, but you maintained your weight, you wouldn't expect your BMR to then decrease. And so, yeah, there was a 2012 study by Harris and colleagues that illustrated this point pretty well. It was an 8-week overfeeding study. And basically, like week 1, subjects' BMRs on average were around 1,700 calories per day. And they had a little under 55 kilos of fat-free mass. And so their, like the average BMR per kilo of fat-free mass was about 31 calories. And then they overfeed for a bit. They are assessing BMR every week. It immediately increases by like 30 calories the first week, but then up to around 100 calories by week 4. So pretty quick 100-calorie increase. And during that period of time, the subjects had only put on about 1.5 kilos of fat-free mass. So now you do see like a slight elevation in BMR per kilo of fat-free mass. It had gone up a bit, but by week 8, BMR had not continued to increase, but the subjects had gained another like 1.5 kilos of fat-free mass or so. And so by that point, their BMR per kilo of fat-free mass was back down to like 31, the same as it was at baseline. So you saw that like initial elevation above baseline, like a disproportionate increase, but then as they continued to gain weight, it just kind of like settled back into what it would normally be, with further increases just scaling with the amount and composition of the weight they gained. So yeah, there is like just a pinch of like short-term quote unquote reverse metabolic adaptation, but it's not a preserved phenomenon. Like you're not going to experience that for the entire duration of the time you lose weight, but it does seem like your BMR does get like a short-term boost that I don't think there's a clear explanation for yet, during the first few weeks of a bulking phase, which is kind of fun. Next topic is BMR in athletes. And this is actually what we're going to wrap up on. There are a couple other articles in the series on the website that might interest folks. One is just talking about the variability of human BMRs and the the frequency and probability of having a BMR like above or below a particular value. Honestly, the main reason I wrote it is it seems like at some point everyone collectively decided that adult humans can never, like literally never, have a BMR under 1,200 calories per day. And like, that's not true. Like it happens. And it's like, it's not the most common thing in the world, but it's not like super uncommon. Like for women, it's like 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. So like, most people will have a BMR above that, but a lot of people, like globally, probably tens to hundreds of millions of adults have BMRs below that. So whatever, I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, and address that thing I often see, but to do so in a rigorous way where no one will feel attacked or called out, hopefully. And then the other one is about the impact of PCOS on BMR, which I think that is a really, really good article if that's a topic that interests you. But I do think that that is a little outside of what we typically talk about on the podcast. And I don't know that getting into that article would make for great audio content because it's very technical. Basically, like here's the TLDR version. There's like a general belief that that women with PCOS, and that's polycystic ovary syndrome, have way lower BMRs than women without PCOS, and in particular that the combination of PCOS and insulin resistance causes like a precipitous decrease in BMR. Like the number you'll often see people quote is that women with PCOS and insulin resistance have BMRs that are 40% below women without PCOS. And that belief seems to be driven by exclusively one study, and that study conceptually isn't the worst study in the world, but it also pretty clearly had measurement errors. Basically, it seems like the device they used to measure BMR in that study was just like a bad device. So yeah, that whole belief seems to be due to a measurement error in a single study, and literally all of the rest of the research on the topic finds no impact of PCOS on BMR. So yeah, if that's a topic that interests you, or if what I said hits your ears as untrue, check out that article, dig into it. I think it will be a fun romp. But yeah, so those are the last two articles in the series, but we're not going to talk about them in detail on this episode. I said we. I'm used to having a co-host. I don't refer to myself in my free time with the royal we. I do realize that I'm one person and typically use singular pronouns to refer to myself. Anyway, BMR and athletes. Let's talk about it to wrap up. So, just for basics to begin with, athletes do tend to have higher BMRs than non-athletes. I think most people are aware of that. But athletes have higher BMRs than non-athletes for reasons other than what I suspect most people believe the reasons are, or at least like the primary reason is different. Seems like most people assume that it's primarily just due to differences in body composition, like the idea that like quote unquote muscle burns more calories than fat. But that actually has a relatively small impact. And if you know the tissue specific metabolic rates of muscle and fat, that should be relatively intuitive. So remember, tissue specific BMR of muscle is like 13 calories per kilogram. For fat, it's 4.5 calories per kilogram. So for every, like, if you lose a kilo of fat and gain a kilo of muscle, you'd expect your BMR to go up by like 8.5 calories, which isn't a ton. And even if you experienced a huge change in body comp, like if you gained 10 kilos of muscle mass, which is a lot, like 22 pounds for Americans listening to this, and lost 10 kilos of fat, which again, that's a lot of fat to lose. We're talking about a full 10 kilo either direction recomp. Like you're 180 pounds and, oh God, I shouldn't put myself on the spot to do this math in my head, so I'm not going to. But yeah, at your current body weight, if you put on 20 plus pounds of muscle, lose 20 plus pounds of fat, you've experienced a tremendous change in body composition. And for most people listening to this, like most people that are like sub 220 or like sub 100 kilos, at that point, like your body comp will probably be pretty close to what like a high level athlete's would be at your body weight. And that would be expected to increase your BMR by like 85 calories, which is a very small difference. But the difference in BMR between athletes and non-athletes that we do observe is much, much larger than that. So that begs the question of why. If it's not primarily due to athletes having more muscle or differences in body comp, which, to be clear, that does contribute. It's just not even close to the most important factor. But yeah, if it's not that, why do athletes have higher BMRs than non-athletes? And if you made it to this point in the episode, I bet you can guess what it is. That's right, baby. We're going back to organs. We're talking about organs more. So previously, when talking about sex differences and just generally smaller people having higher BMRs per kilo of fat-free mass than larger people, I mentioned that as total fat-free mass increases, the proportion of fat-free mass accounted for by high metabolic rate organ mass tends to decrease. Like it's around 8% for someone with 40 kilos of fat-free mass and around 6% for someone with 80 kilos of fat-free mass. And that is what we see in the general population. That's not what we see with athletes, though. With athletes, high metabolic rate organ mass more or less stays the same across different levels of body mass. So the only high metabolic rate organ for which that does not apply is the brain, which is good. Like you don't want your brain getting bigger as you get more jacked. Your skull has a finite amount of volume, and your brain's got to stay in there. But yeah, like for heart mass, kidney mass, liver mass, those all seem to increase linearly with fat-free mass in athletes, whereas the mass of each of those organs relative to total fat-free mass tends to decrease in in non-athletic populations. So basically, if you picked like two people off the street, and one of them had 50% more total fat-free mass than the other, and again, like I mentioned before, we're not looking at like strong like R of 0.99 relationships between high metabolic rate organ mass and fat-free mass. Like, to be clear, that still applies. But just if you knew nothing else about them, pick two people off the street. One of them has 50% more fat-free mass than the other, and you said like, hey, how much more liver mass do you think the bigger guy has than the smaller guy? You might reasonably predict like 25% more liver mass. Due to that, like, you know, bigger people do have larger high metabolic rate organs than smaller people, but it doesn't, like, it scales sublinearly with total fat-free mass. For athletes, on the other hand, if you picked two athletes like off of a competition pitch or whatever, and one of them had 50% more fat-free mass than the other, you would also expect that person to have 50%, like a 50% larger liver, a 50% larger heart, 50% larger kidneys. Like you see that like basically linear scaling with athletes. And so as a result, BMR per unit of fat-free mass doesn't change very much in athletes of, like, it doesn't vary much in athletes of different levels of fat-free mass. Like it does tend to increase like pretty linearly with like an intercept very close to zero. So yeah, to quantify that for the article, for the website, and then for the BMR equation that's now used in the Macro Factor app. I was looking at I was looking at the research on BMRs in athletes, and I was like, like, as I was digging into it, I was like, we need to use different equations for athletes and non-athletes. Like the difference is just too large. For equations that use like height, weight, age, and sex, because athletes have like different body comp at the same height and weight as non-athletes. And even when scaling to fat-free mass, like especially larger athletes, BMR per kilo of fat-free mass in especially like larger athletes is quite a bit higher than non-athletes with similar amounts of fat-free mass. And so I started by just kind of looking at research that had evaluated the accuracy and validity of pre-existing prediction equations. But and the 1980 Cunningham equation does pretty good. The 10-half equation does pretty good. But a lot of them weren't tested in like that many samples, but there were a lot of samples and a lot of studies that did report both fat-free mass and BMR in samples of athletes. So I was like, I've already found all of these studies. How much extra work would it be to just extract this data and do a meta-regression? So that's what I did. And so yeah, you can check out the article if that interests you. But yeah, if you're interested in like a linear equation, like the final version is allometrically scaled, as is the final version of our BMR equations for general population as well. Longtime listeners of the podcast, and this might cause a pang of sadness for people who've been listening from the start. This might be the last time you ever hear me sing the praises of allometric scaling on the podcast. But yeah, so they're allometrically scaled, like power law scaling. But yeah, just for linear equations, for a point of comparison, the equation for athletes is 28.9 times fat-free mass plus 108 versus the 1991 Cunningham equation, which does pretty well for people in the general population. That equation is 21.6 times fat-free mass plus 370. So the coefficient that you're multiplying fat-free mass by is way bigger in athletes than in the general population. And the intercept is much closer to 0, which basically means that like per unit of fat-free mass gained, it's more like a larger increase in BMR in athletes. But since that intercept is closer to 0, that means that BMR per kilo of fat-free mass changes less as fat-free mass increases. Like that's kind of how you can interpret the differences in those two equations there. And another upshot of that is that the difference in BMR between athletes and non-athletes is smaller for people with less total fat-free mass and larger for people with more total fat-free mass. Just a little thing to note. And the exciting bit of all of this is you might be listening and thinking like, well, how useful is any of that to me? You know, like, could this just be a cross-sectional difference where like high-level athletes are just like different from non-athletes, such that like, you know, maybe elite athletes can become elite athletes just because they have larger organs than non-athletes, you know, like they have larger kidneys that can like filter like the urea that they generate during exercise faster than everyone else. And they have larger kidneys to like metabolize all of the like waste products their muscles generate. It's not actually waste products, but even to like do the Cori cycle to like recycle lactate faster than non-athletes. And that's, you know, like we're not looking at an adaptation to training. We're just looking at cross-sectional differences between athletes and non-athletes. You may be thinking that to yourself, but the exciting bit here is that the like the increase in metabolic rate, the higher metabolic rates in athletes seem to be a training adaptation more so than just a difference between like the athlete and non-athlete population. Like it seems like something where it's not just like athletes are different from us, they have higher BMRs and there's not much you can do about it. So to support that, for starters, in the studies that like went into my analysis, I split them out by elite versus sub-elite or recreational athletes to see like, hey, are we observing higher BMRs at a given level of fat-free mass in elite athletes than sub-elite or recreational athletes? And we do not. Like there's the same relationship between BMR and fat-free mass in both elite and non-elite athletes, which suggests that it's not just like, oh, you need these organ-related characteristics to become an elite athlete, and that's why the BMR is higher. Even folks like one of the studies was just people who worked out at a particular CrossFit gym, and they had BMRs that fell along the same regression line as like professional rugby players. So, it's not like it was only the most elite of the elite that seemed to have these elevations in BMR. Second is there was a 2020 meta-analysis by McKinsey Shoulders and colleagues that analyzed changes in BMR after exercise interventions. And most of the studies feeding into that meta-analysis lasted for around 12 weeks. And during that period of time, the average increase in BMR observed was around 80 calories, which may not sound like much, but that is way more than you would expect BMR to increase, purely just based on changes in body composition over that time span. So, like if that 80 calorie increase in BMR was to be explained by like increases in muscle mass, people would need to gain like 6 kilos of muscle in 12 weeks. And based on some other research, it seems like the average increase in muscle mass over 12 weeks for people doing full body resistance exercise is like 1.5 kilos. So that 80 calorie increase, even in the studies where people were doing resistance training, you can't explain that just by them gaining enough muscle to explain an 80 calorie increase. And an increase of a similar magnitude was also observed in people doing aerobic training, and you're definitely not gaining 6 kilos of muscle mass in 12 weeks of, cardio. So yeah, that also suggests that, we're seeing elevations in BMR that aren't just explainable by changes in body mass in just normal people that start exercising. And finally, there is actually a bit of longitudinal research documenting proportional increases in organ size with training in athletes. So there was a 2013 paper by Mialchi and colleagues titled "Organ Size Increases with Weight Gain in Power-Trained Athletes." And basically, like, this was a study on football players where they looked at muscle mass and also liver, kidney, brain, and heart mass in freshman players and seniors or like upperclassmen. And they saw that the upperclassmen had more total fat-free mass and also larger organs. And then there was a longitudinal component as well, where it's like, hey, these freshmen, they're going to be trying to get bigger for football. They're going to be training hard. They're going to be eating to put on muscle, and let's see what happens. And in the course of a year, they put on like 5.2 kilos of total fat-free mass, and their increase in heart, kidney, and liver mass was proportional to that increase in total fat-free mass. So like if just to like, these weren't the exact numbers, but just to illustrate, like if total fat-free mass increased by 5%, heart mass also increased by 5%, kidney mass also increased by 5%, liver mass also increased by 5%. So there is actually like longitudinal research observing proportional increases in muscle mass with increases in total fat-free mass in like athletes lifting weights. So it's not just like it's not just like a cross-sectional comparison between athletes and non-athletes. Like when like we do actually see the changes and increases in organ mass over time as people are training that would lead one to predict like proportional increases in BMR. So yeah. Athletes have higher BMRs than non-athletes, and it mostly seems to be due to organs, and most importantly for you, if you're not currently exercising and you start exercising pretty hard, your BMR will probably go up, and some of that will be due to the muscle mass you gain, and it does seem like some of that will be due to you gaining organ mass in a way that is, to be clear, benign or beneficial. So yeah, very cool. When you start working out, your BMR goes up a bit more than you would expect it to, just based on how much muscle you gain. So yeah, that's it. That's what I've got for this episode. I just want to make 2 quick notes, which is one, if you want to try out the BMR calculator that ended up resulting from all of this legwork I did, you can check that out. If you just Google macro factor BMR calculator, I'm sure it'll come up, or the link to it will be in the show notes. All of the articles in the BMR series will be linked under it as well, and it will talk a bit more about kind of the rationale for the new macro factor BMR equations. And second, we are funding some research to improve further on that and do even better, to be able to try to estimate and understand BMR as well as we possibly can. So yeah, there's a absolute shitload of BMR research. There was a study from 2013, I believe, by the lead author was Sabunchi. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but that is how it looks. That's how I would think I would say it. Where I won't bore you with the details, but basically, like, part of the study included like doing an accounting of all of the studies that had just tried to make their own new BMR equations. And there were, I think at the time, like 248 as of like 2013. So that's not every study that has assessed BMR. That's like everyone where the researchers were like, and we're going to try to make a new equation for this population. So there's probably at least 500-600 studies on the topic. And so that's a ripe body of research to meta-analyze and meta-regress. But it has never been done in a truly like thorough and systematic way. And I think the reason for that is just that it is a project that is so big that like I don't think researchers would bother undertaking it without it being funded. Because a meta-analysis is not a trivial amount of work, but it's like it's a fair bit of work if you're meta-analyzing a body of research that has like a dozen studies, and like a lot of that work is just finding the studies and extracting the data. But then if it's like an area of research where the number of relevant studies is like in the hundreds, now you're multiplying the amount of work it takes many-fold. And so like no one's gonna do that just to be like, it'll get cited a lot, like I'm sure it'll be worth it. You're gonna be like, there's got to be something else I can do with a more reasonable like benefit to work ratio there, unless it's funded. And if it's funded, people are like, okay, like I can do some funded research. But yeah, like I think the only reason that it hasn't been meta-analyzed the way it needs to be is just that it is like such an intimidatingly large project. And I assume that there just hasn't ever been adequate funding for it, but I think it is something that should exist, and we can fund it, so we are. And so we're working with James Steele to carry out a large project to really help us understand the body of BMR research better, and hopefully be able to predict and understand BMR more accurately in a variety of different populations. So be on the lookout. That is already underway, and we're hoping to finish it up in about a year or so. But yeah, so that is currently rolling along. So that's it as far as stuff for this episode goes. So remember, next episode, all Q&A. This is your best time to ask a question for the podcast, and record those voice clips, 60 seconds or less, and email them to podcast@strongerbyscience.com. And I will talk to you in another couple of weeks. All right. Be good. See you then.